welcome to the program. Today, we tackle the concept of ceasefires. We've heard about this in so many conflicts around the world as a goal state to end conflict, or at least end the active component of conflict. But how does this actually work? Saying that you want a ceasefire and everybody put the guns down sounds great and easy, and who wouldn't want that? But to actually get there, there's an enormous amount of work that goes into this, a tremendous amount of diplomacy and statesmanship to even get to a conversation around how you begin to work towards a ceasefire, let alone implement one and enforce it. So we thought it was important, since this is a topic that sadly is going to continue to be top of mind for people around the world as conflicts continue to rage, that we should get a better understanding of the legal terminology and the practical effects and implementations and lessons learned from past ceasefires and the different types of ceasefires that there are around the world. For this conversation, we invited Marika Sosnowski to join us. She's an Australian qualified lawyer, a postdoctoral research fellow at Melbourne Law School, and a research associate at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg. Her work sits at the intersection of socio-political, legal anthropology. Her primary research interests are in the fields of critical security studies, mainly ceasefires, local rebel governance, and legal systems, particularly issues around citizenship and belonging, with a geographical focus on the conflict in Syria. From June 2023 until May 2026, she's based in the Peter McMullen Center on Statelessness at Melbourne Law School, working on a postdoctoral project which examines the legal afterlife of war and revolution. The project aims to better understand how people internalize and experience the law at an everyday level after mass violence or world-shaping events. Marika's academic work has been published in Citizenship Studies, International Studies Quarterly, the Leiden Journal of International Law, and Civil Wars, among others. Her first book, Redefining Ceasefires, Wartime Order and State Building in Syria, came out in June 2023 with Cambridge University Press. She has also published a range of more public-facing work, including for Middle East Eye, The New Humanitarian, the Lieber Institute West Point, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the Atlantic Council, and the Washington Institute. So we are thrilled to have Marika join us today, one of the foremost experts and researchers on this concept. And hopefully this conversation educates all of you and all of us on the complexities of what seems on the surface to be such a simple concept, and yet there's so much to it. And Marika's research, particularly in Syria, maybe offers us some lessons and key insights as to how these can be implemented in active conflicts around the world today. So I present to you my conversation with Marika Sosnowski. Marika, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me here, Brian. It's a pleasure.
All right, I've given a bit of an introduction, just a standard bio, but nobody can introduce themselves like themselves. So I'd like to give you a moment to introduce yourself and your background to our audience.
Thanks very much. So my name's Marika Sosnowski. I'm coming to you from Boonwurrung land in Australia today. It's very important to me that we acknowledge the traditional custodians where we are in Australia, particularly as today we're going to talk a little bit about conflict and war, and obviously that war is kind of ongoing for a lot of our First Nations people here in Australia. So I'm a research fellow currently at Melbourne Law School, and there I look at the dynamics of ceasefires, and I also look at the kind of how ceasefires affect the micro dynamics of conflict, you could say. So things like citizenship and property rights, things like local level governance, territory and security control, all kinds of things like that.
So we're going to begin with the ill definition of ceasefire, which means 20 things to 20 people if you ask them. So nobody has probably researched this as much as you in recent years. So help our audience understand that term and how you think about it.
It's such an interesting thing to think about, actually, because ceasefire, it sounds very obvious, doesn't it? It sounds like the definition we all think about when we think about a ceasefire is that it's sort of an agreement that stops fire for a period of time, basically. So that's the basic definition of a ceasefire. So within that, we could have a lot of things, right? We could have things that are called a ceasefire, or we could have things that are called humanitarian pause, or a cessation of hostilities, or a de-escalation zone, or a truce, for example, or an amnesty. All of these things, all of these words kind of fall under that really broad definition of a ceasefire. What my work does is kind of problematizes that a little bit and says that actually, in reality, a ceasefire rarely only just ceases fire, and sometimes it actually never just ceases fire. So we need a little bit of a broader definition to capture all the different areas beyond just stopping violence that a ceasefire could affect. So I say that a ceasefire creates a particular situation, it's a particular agreement that creates this particular situation, a particular wartime order. It's a bit academic, order that then and that order has ramifications for all sorts of things on the ground, basically.
So there's no internationally accepted legal definition of ceasefire, right? This has to come down to the combatants actually agreeing to terms and then putting that label on it.
Again, it's so interesting historically. So ceasefires have been around ever since war. People have gone to war, basically. So historically, they had quite a religious provenance. They were sort of endowed with a kind of humanitarian, a religious idea. They were known originally as a truce of God. And since then, they've kind of had this aura about them that they're just ipso facto humanitarian, they're positive things. We should all want a ceasefire in conflict. And there's actually no international legal definition of what a ceasefire is. There's very few provisions that sort of mean that, for example, you can't send an emissary that can then turn around and kill all the people that you're sending the emissary to. So they're quite antiquated provisions in international law, but they still kind of make sense. But there's no really specific provisions around what a ceasefire needs to contain in terms of its terms, when a ceasefire needs to be negotiated in a conflict, who needs to negotiate that ceasefire. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because obviously every conflict is really different. And I think international law has deliberately not codified that so that it leaves it open to the parties to a conflict, whoever those parties are and whatever that conflict looks like, to decide on what that ceasefire will look like for any particular conflict.
So I know some of the research you talked about, there's humanitarian pauses, which we've heard a little bit about in recent times. There's sort of a ceasefire as an interim solution to advance peace negotiations, and then there are these more permanent ceasefires where the intention is that hostilities will secede for the indefinite future. Uh, is that something that sort of evolves naturally through the negotiation process? Do people know when they begin a quote unquote ceasefire which one of these three they're entering into, and how do you even get started on that conversation between two warring parties?
It's a tricky question. I think parties who are negotiating a ceasefire, obviously there's sometimes, not always, there's a mediator involved. It depends what kind of ceasefire we're talking about. Often there's more local level ceasefires that are negotiated directly between the parties to a conflict, or there is a more local level mediator or an international mediator, some of who we know about. I think the parties to the conflict are always trying to negotiate the best deal for themselves, right, in a ceasefire. And what that looks like at any given point in time in a conflict will be very different. I think what my research says is that you can have the parties that are negotiating the ceasefire, but then obviously that ceasefire, whatever is agreed, definitely has ramifications for a lot of other actors involved in the conflict as well. So you could have, for example, an internationally negotiated ceasefire, like, for example, the de-escalation zone agreements in Syria, which happened in 2017. So that was an agreement signed by the Syrian government, Syrian regime, or actually they weren't a party to the agreement. It was signed by Turkey, Russia, and Iran on behalf of the sort of Syrian regime that had effect over the territory of Syria. So those actors signed the agreement, but then it had a lot of different effects on the ground for different people. And I mean, the current incantation of that agreement is that we have Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and its Salvation Government basically in control of the Idlib province in Syria, which was basically not wholly, but one of the main reasons that control has now come about was because of these de-escalation zone agreements. So all these kind of different things can flow from different agreements that maybe the parties think about, but I think in most cases they don't really, and particularly when they're negotiated on that sort of international level.
Let's talk about that example you just mentioned in Syria. That is a fascinating one because you have effectively a ceasefire in place, but the main belligerent, as you said, didn't sign the agreement and just sort of stepped back and were forced into some version of it. How unusual is that in your research that outside parties effectively had to negotiate a deal without the primary combatant, who is technically internationally the government, the governing body over this territory, and yet effectively had lost control of it?
That's a really good question. I can't think of any other ones off the top of my head, but that are specific. But obviously, in these kind of conflicts, there's always, not always, but there's often states have sort of patron states that are, that are supporting them or pressuring them in various ways. I mean, we see that currently with the war in Gaza, that Israel is pursuing. The United States is obviously a big patron of Israel, and there's differing views as to how much control the United States has over Israel. For example, if the United States says tomorrow, look, guys, we need to have a ceasefire. Sorry, we're going to cut off aid to you and we're going to cut off weapon sales. Would that mean that Israel would just necessarily be forced into having a ceasefire? I don't know the answer to that question, but you would suspect that it might factor into their calculation about whether they would want a ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon as well. So I think that sort of patron state or sponsors, different states, different mediators can put pressure on different parties to come to some sort of deal, for sure.
Now, a lot of your research also covers the governance. So once you have implemented some form of ceasefire, assuming there is a portion of that territory that is now under an alternative government, it's not easy to set up a structure of government. It's hard enough to maintain the structures when there's peacetime. What does your research tell us about the foundations of just getting started? Once the guns stop, where do you even begin so that you can start to have some form of stability?
My research actually started on ceasefires because I was working on an international development project over 10 years ago now in Syria. So in 2013, that at that time aimed to support what was called the moderate Syrian opposition develop governance structures in the areas that they controlled in Syria at that time. And when we spoke to Syrians, we were involved in helping them build local councils, courts and judiciaries, a police service, things like that. And when we spoke to Syrians about how those kind of governance structures were going in those areas that the opposition controlled, they would say to us, look, they're going fine until the Assad regime comes over and bombs us. And then basically everything falls apart, understandably. So that was the kind of seed that got me thinking about ceasefires more specifically, and made me think, well, if there was a ceasefire for a certain amount of time, how would those governance institutions develop further, and what would that look like? So when I then did a lot of research specifically into this topic, so I interviewed over 80 people that knew that had specific experience with local governance initiatives in Syria, with ceasefire mediators in the Syrian context, and with sort of humanitarian professionals and conflict analysts. I read a lot of ceasefires as well. So what that then became clear to me, it wasn't quite as simple as the bomb stop and the governance institutions grow and develop further. It was a little bit more complicated than that in the Syrian context, at least. So one of the examples I looked at was the 2016 cessation of hostilities and how that affected local governance initiatives in the south of Syria and in the southern province of Daraa. And basically, that ceasefire actually did stop violence more broadly over the governorate of Daraa relatively well. And one thing that happened as a result of that ceasefire, though, in terms of how violence kind of morphed, was that it enabled the regime and affiliates to conduct a lot of targeted assassinations of local leaders, for example. So it wasn't that these bombs were falling, raining down as they were before on the general population. It was that local leaders who were really knowledgeable about what was happening in terms of local governance, that were really involved in local governance, were being directly assassinated by the regime and ISIS affiliates in that area. So that had a really destabilizing effect on the local governance initiatives that were happening in the south, even though the overall body count was much less because of the ceasefire, for example. The other thing that happened in the south was a lot of the local leaders, the sheikhs or different people in the area who were considered notables or leaders in that area, so doctors, lawyers, had such a good, this is, from their historic links with those areas, they had such a good knowledge about how the different dynamics in their towns or in their regions worked, that they were able to use the kind of lull in violence that the ceasefire created to improve their positions or to do governance in a way that benefited them or benefited their clan or their families or different ways. For example, some of the local sheikhs got much more involved in the local councils, for example, and stacked them with members of their own sort of family, so that a lot of the councils were controlled by different notable families. Just things like that were much more granular in detail. Whereas you could technically say that the ceasefire was quite successful in that it dropped overall levels of violence, but it then had these recalibrating effects on governance on the ground for the people that were actually living there.
So we'll come back to in a moment the topic of the use of ceasefires for one side or the other to gain advantages. Let me go back to the building blocks of governance. You mentioned a couple of elements there. There's courts, there's public safety, certainly healthcare, certainly infrastructure. These are all things we take for granted in peace times. Which of those did you feel is sort of paramount to the others? Is it reestablishing some form of rule of law and a court system to adjudicate issues? Was it just basic public safety? Was it basic infrastructure to get some sort of lights on and water running? What is the priority to kind of get off on the right foot once the guns stop?
That's a really interesting question. I think the answer, it will probably depend on the different situations that people find themselves in. And I think all those things you just mentioned are really important. What is primary, it probably depends on the situation. And also what's been really interesting in my research is how those different governance structures that are sort of embryonic, they're territories that have fallen outside state control for a period of time, usually during a civil war. They can be a town or a small community, or they can be a larger territorial area. One really interesting thing that I've come across is how those different leaders or governance structures in that community relate back to the state that they've fallen outside of control of, for example. So I've done a lot of work specifically on civil registry systems. So it's a bit of an overlooked area because you think, there's war going on, people are just dealing with the war. But of course, in a lot of these situations, life continues regardless, especially when war goes on for a long time and children get born, people get married, people die, and those events need to be documented in some certain way. So, for example, in the Syrian context, I looked very specifically at the Syrian interim government, who set up quite a complex system of civil registry offices in the areas that they controlled. But one of the ways they thought about it was that they thought they were eventually going to take over the state, the Syrian state. So those registry systems and the way they organized them was very legal in their heads. Like, they followed law very specifically, but they always thought, and that was because they wanted those booklets that they were updating and those certificates that they were making and those IDs that they were printing for the people that lived in those areas they controlled. They were just all going to slot straight back into the to the Syrian government system once they took over Damascus, basically. And of course, sadly, we know now in the Syrian case that that hasn't happened. And what did happen is, when the Syrian regime retook these areas from the Syrian opposition, those identity cards and those birth certificates became a real security problem for a lot of those people, because the Syrian regime saw them as a sign of kind of treason and a sign of their opposition to the Syrian government, the fact that they had gotten these birth certificates or marriage certificates and things like that. So they became dangerous, for example. In another conflict like Sri Lanka, when the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, controlled the area in the north of the country, they did it differently. They kept the civil registry systems the government had set up in that area. They kept them operating. They didn't see that aspect as being important to their kind of state building activities. So that was quite a different thing. I think they were probably going to do it eventually. They didn't get the chance to do it eventually because they were defeated, but they saw that as the last thing, or one of the final things that they would do, whereas the Syrians saw that actually as very important in the beginning. So it depends, I think, a little bit where you are and what the priorities are of the people that are in control of a different area.
Fascinating. The unintended consequences of what might have seemed like a positive idea and just trying to restore some sense of order. All right, let's talk about this concept, though, which I think often is the barrier to ceasefires, which is the suspicion that that time will simply be used by either side or one side as a rearming, retooling, re-strategizing moment. So the first way I want to approach this is, how is that discussed in your research? I mean, is it a formal discussion, or is it just sort of an agreement that, hey, we know this is a risk, but we feel like both sides have to take that now to have any step towards peace? It seems to be one of the strongest barriers to getting to any ceasefire, is that suspicion that it's just going to be exploited. Talk a little bit about how you've seen that handled in those early negotiations, and then what practically happens in the midst of most ceasefires.
So yeah, parties will always try and use the ceasefire to the ends that suit them the most. The way I've seen that play out in the ceasefires that I've looked at the most is via the negotiations, I guess, around the terms of the ceasefire. So I think a lot, in my opinion, I think negotiators spend a lot of time thinking about the terms of the ceasefire, but often they're done quite by rote. There's actually a ceasefire drafter's handbook that's available, which literally has different terms that ceasefire negotiators can pull out and put into their whatever ceasefire they happen to be negotiating at any given time. So there's this idea, I think, in the mediation community that certain terms, like around security sector reform or around demobilization of combatants, or how far combatants are going to be away from each other, different things like that, need to be included in ceasefires. And I think what my research says is that maybe that's true. Some of those terms do need to be included, but we also need to think more carefully and more in a more nuanced way about how those terms relate to the people on the ground, that those ceasefires, who are most affected by those ceasefires. So, for example, humanitarian corridors or a humanitarian pause is a great example of that, because we think by those words, we think, oh, great, it's nice, it's humanitarian, it's a corridor, it all sounds very nice on face value. But we know from different conflicts like Ukraine or even in Gaza, humanitarian corridors have been proposed. And in Ukraine, they were proposed by Putin, but those corridors led from Mariupol, to a Russian territory or to Belarus, or they weren't safe for people to go along in the first place. So they weren't agreed to in Ukraine, even though they were proposed. Similarly, in Gaza, humanitarian corridors have, completely displaced people, often multiple times in that conflict. So they're not. I guess my research says, look, these things might sound good on face value, but we have to actually look at their practical consequences for the people most affected. And kind of, it's very then obvious in my mind to come to the conclusion that these things aren't always humanitarian and positive.
You mentioned there's sort of a handbook. Is there like a formal documentation of, based on lessons learned throughout the decades of these are best practices for ceasefires?
I guess that was why it was compiled. I think it's available online if people want to. You can Google it and probably find it. I think it was compiled with that in mind. I mean, it's definitely something that was compiled at that sort of international level for mediators who were working more on that sort of international plane rather than for local ceasefires. But I think it probably trickles down to that level as well. And I guess, yeah, it was thought of as, look, these are the things that over time mediators have felt that we need to include. And like I said, that may be true to a certain extent, but what my research tries to do is sort of question that a little bit more and ask mediators to really think about the consequences of those terms for the people most affected.
So I'm curious about the governance though of these. So once the combatants have reached some sort of terms, it's not like this is, well, maybe I'm wrong. Is it a legally binding agreement when both sides quote unquote sign a ceasefire? And if it is, who is the enforcer if anybody breaks the rules?
So a ceasefire is not technically legally binding, but I think maybe one of the best sort of ways possibly to think about a ceasefire is it's like a contract. Two parties agree to the contract, but sometimes even in our daily lives, people break contracts, right? So a ceasefire is probably best thought of like that. There's technically no look whether there's sanction. I mean, in daily life, obviously, we have laws in the countries that we live in for breaking a contract. Technically, I guess per international law or domestic law, there's no sanction technically for breaking a ceasefire, breaking that contract that you've made. Obviously, the sanction then, depending on what kind of conflict you're talking about, comes from the international community via different means, like economic sanctions or diplomatic sanction, statements, all those different norms that the international community has available to say, look, you've broken this ceasefire and that's not a good thing, we don't like it. But practically, or withdrawal of support from some of those patron states that I mentioned earlier. But practically speaking, there's no sanction. One interesting aspect is often we have some sort of monitoring mechanism, like they're talking about that, for example, in the Gaza context at the moment a little bit, that, if there was a ceasefire, then there would be an Arab-led monitoring mechanism to make sure that the terms of that ceasefire were adhered to. That was the case in Syria as well. There was a United Nations supervision mechanism, UNSMIS, for Syria as well. What my research says, sadly, a lot of times when ceasefires are signed that include some sort of monitoring mechanism, and they can also be called, they called a lot of things a different monitoring mechanism, interim mechanism, all these kind of words. A lot of the times, in my experience, those monitoring mechanisms have kind of been, or whoever that actor is, has been kind of used as a bit of a scapegoat. They're used to say, look, we've signed a deal, but and the monitoring mechanism comes in, but then the parties to the conflict kind of keep on fighting anyway, and basically blame it on the monitoring mechanism that they're not doing their job properly, and it's not working. That was definitely the case in Syria with the United Nations supervision mechanism. They went in, they were completely ineffectual. They actually almost gave cover to the Syrian regime to keep on bombing and to escalate the conflict, because the worldview was on the monitoring mechanism, basically. And kind of like, oh, look, great, we've got a monitoring mechanism there now. But the regime just continued.
So this is a little bit, sort of academic theory here, but what you hear some people say is that the downside of a ceasefire is that it often doesn't result in a formal peace treaty. And so it is a stalling tactic, and it can leave a conflict frozen, and yet it's still a conflict. Both sides are still mobilized, and basically all it takes is one combatant or one mistake, quite frankly, to restart the conflict. So in other words, there are those who argue that a ceasefire, while good on paper, if it actually forestalls getting to a treaty, it may do more harm than good, because it just gives you a short-term lull and you have a blow up in violence. What's your view on that critique? Does your research tell us anything about whether ceasefires accelerate the path to a treaty, or just leave conflicts frozen indefinitely?
It's a good question, because I think ceasefires are tricky because they can come at all sorts of different times in a conflict, close to a peace agreement. And often a peace agreement itself would contain some sort of clause that looks very much like a ceasefire would look. So that temporal question of when a ceasefire comes in a conflict, and what it does vis-a-vis a kind of more permanent peace, is a really interesting one, and it's a really tricky one to answer. One of the things, for example, I looked at in Syria, it's a little bit of a different take on your question, but for example, in Syria, they had these things called reconciliation agreements, which were kind of local ceasefires. And I looked at them in the sense, there were different types of ones, but some of the ones that I looked at in Syria were really kind of punitive agreements that actually ended the conflict. So you could look at them like they were kind of a final. I wouldn't call them a peace agreement in any way, although they were called reconciliation agreements, which again kind of has this idea that they were positive. So these reconciliation agreements came about in towns like Daraya and Old Homs initially, after a very intense period of siege and bombardment of these rebel-held towns by the Syrian regime. And basically the Syrian regime then, I'm talking in some cases like Daraya, it was years of siege and bombardment, where no aid or very little aid could get into these areas, but people could not come and go. And so then eventually the people in these communities were forced into accepting the terms of these so-called reconciliation agreements as a kind of strangle contract, I guess you could call it. And then under the terms of those deals, in some cases, Daraya being one of them, the people, many of the people from Daraya were then, or actually all of the people from Daraya were evacuated under the terms of those agreements, and the regime retook the town. So in a way you could say, oh, that was, from the regime's point of view, that was a great agreement. We've got peace. Peace in inverted commas in that town now. There's not a problem anymore. But obviously from the perspective of the citizens of Daraya, they're now either in exile in Idlib without any right to return to their homes in Daraya, or some of them still remain in Syria but under really tight security control. So it's a really tricky question to do with like how a ceasefire relates to a peace agreement, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, we could look at the Ukrainian example as, one option, right? There was an initial conflict. Crimea was primarily involved in that. There was some of the eastern territories, and then there was a cessation, effectively a ceasefire. It lasted for many years. The Ukrainian government, I think, to this day would say, well, yeah, I guess, but it certainly wasn't a treaty that settled the issue. And then, of course, we ended up with a large scale conflict, almost a decade later. So, in that sort of a context, one of the barriers, it seems, to having another settlement there is this concern that if it's just a ceasefire, and it's not part of a larger peace agreement long term, are we just setting ourselves up for another major conflict a few years down the road? So
Mm.
maybe using that as a pragmatic example, how would your research, or the folks who you work with, would you all consider, the 2014 agreement to have been successful in the sense that it did indeed secede violence for a period of time and enabled some rebuilding and governance, but in the end it simply resulted in a larger conflict later?
I think that's interesting because I think, under the traditional view of ceasefires, which is sort of an agreement that stops violence for a period of time, that kind of agreement in Ukraine would be considered to be really successful, right? As would the agreement in Dorea that I was just talking to you about as well. So great, really successful ceasefire. It stopped violence in the Syrian case completely, in the Ukrainian case, more or less. But what my research says is that, look, we need to look more closely at these dynamics, as to what's happening on the ground. And in the Syrian case, like I've said, citizenship rights, property rights were really reconfigured in the Dorea case. And in the Ukrainian case, also really interesting example. I mean, one of the things I know about that conflict is that during that time after the agreement was signed, this ceasefire, Russia set about a program of really this sort of passportization of many of the citizens in those areas that were sort of occupied by Russia during that time. So it basically, through different policies and legislation of its own, mandated or at least forced a lot of the citizens that were notionally Ukrainian citizens to get Russian identity cards, for example, or get Russian pensions and things like that, as a way to kind of try to broaden the scope of its territory through making those people Russian, basically. So, again, if we look more closely at what's happening on the ground during these periods that we think about it as a ceasefire, that where the violence might have lowered or stopped, lots of things are happening, basically.
So you are really studying people, right? This is really a study of the individuals involved. I would love your take on what you've learned through your research about people in times of conflict, and who are some of the personality types that, I don't know, lend themselves more to finding compromise, and then the personality types that are just hell bent on conflict to the end. So much of this is the study of people, and I love your take on if there's a certain type of leader that you see that's more likely than not to find those pieces of compromise, and maybe what that tells us about the world that we see now and the kind of leaders who we would need to turn to have these agreements be put in place.
Wow, it's a tricky question. I mean, I love the way you put it, though, Brian. I mean, I think that's spot on in terms of my research really is about people, and it's tried to, like I said at the beginning when I acknowledged the traditional custodians here of this land. I mean, I think it's so important to think. I think too often we get caught up, especially us, in the West and in the international community, uh, get caught up with sort of very much this high level analysis, either whether it's a geopolitical analysis, Israel did this, Iran did this, Syria did this, Russia did this, the mediators did that. And we don't think about the people really affected by what's going on the ground. So, if anything, my research is really a call to kind of refocus and to think about how these things that we call ceasefire agreements affect people on the ground. Um, One thing I'll say, that in times of conflict, people are amazing. I mean, people, like I said to you before, life continues during conflict. I mean, amazingly and quite inspiringly, people find people's will to survive and to continue despite sometimes enormous pressures is quite amazing, quite ingenious. And so we have to kind of consider how ingenious people are in those certain circumstances and be inspired by that, I think, in many cases. In terms of whether there's people, what the kind of personality type is for making deals, or, being a good negotiator. I mean, maybe it's speaking like in a little bit of an optimistic way, but I think in some ways, look, I think anyone who sort of can that has knowledge of their community, that has connections to their community, like real connections, but also is empathetic in terms of can understand, at least to a certain extent, what is happening on the other side of the equation, or sides, as in many cases. I think that's always going to be a good thing, whether it's even in interpersonal conflict, right? As we're seeing more and more these days. I think more and more empathy, the more empathy we can have and the more understanding of the kind of baggage that people bring to this moment in time is always going to be a good thing.
Well, one element of that is age. It's a little bit of a stereotype, but what you'll hear is, if you have mediators who've been around longer, leaders who've been around longer, maybe they have a more mature view of the world, of their community, that it can be easier to find an agreement there than sometimes when you have young, brash leaders trying to prove themselves. Maybe they don't have as much experience. Maybe they're a bit more radical. Does your research tell us anything about an age difference and how folks involved look at these conflicts depending on their experiences?
Often culturally, I guess, age is a factor in terms of, a lot of the local leaders or people even in our culture that we consider more wise or get these kind of positions are older, right? So that's a culturally ingrained kind of thing. But I think often in the Syria cases that I've been involved with, it's not necessarily been older people. I mean, although sometimes it has, like sheikhs are often sort of a little bit older, for example, but a lot of the local leaders in some of the towns are probably, I would say, on the younger side, because they're sort of often they hold important roles in the community. I mentioned that to you already. So they're doctors or lawyers or people that are well respected for the knowledge that they bring to the community, not just in terms of conflict negotiation, but in terms of skills like teaching or things like that. And that doesn't necessarily have to be something where you need to be 50, 60. It can be something that you have when you're 25, 30, and some of the best or some of really interesting local leaders that I've come across have been sort of within that age category as well.
What do you think about the idea that as you're growing up in a period of conflict, this becomes your normal and this is what you know? Does the research that you've done, the work that you've done, the people you met, are people who grow up in conflict, who are shaped by that conflict, in some ways better positioned or worse positioned to find compromise? The stereotypes, right? What we hear in the media is that if you've been in a war zone for 10 years, 15 years of your life, and you're hardened and you've seen people pass away and you have, maybe revenge on your mind, that the longer the conflict goes, the more you've lived in it and been raised in it, the more it perpetuates itself. I don't know that that's true. I don't know that that doesn't just exhaust you and want to get you to a period of peace. Does your research or the folks that you've talked to give you any insights one way or the other on this idea?
I think that some of those things that you've just mentioned are probably more sort of broad brushstrokes and maybe kind of stereotypes that we have of people that have experienced violence for a long time. Some of the research I'm doing currently has to do with how people understand the law in the aftermath of violence, for example, at a really everyday level. So I've been doing quite a lot of research with Syrians, just as one example, who've had experience at checkpoints in Syria. And when I say checkpoints, I define that very broadly. So, it could be a very traditional checkpoint like you and I would think about, where your car is forced into a lane and you have to show your identity documents. But it can also be an encounter between a person and state security, for example, like the police or something like that, to renew an identity document or something like that. So when I talk to Syrians about how what that experience was like for them in Syria, they talk about it in a very complicated way, in a very ambiguous way, about how the law and violence worked in Syria. It was very ambiguous what would happen in those situations, and that made them feel quite unsure about the outcome, and their feelings were sometimes mixed, very sort of fearful, very sad, sometimes very conflicted about how the law and violence worked in Syria. But then, when I speak to them again, and most of these people have been displaced from Syria, and now they're in places like Australia or in Germany, different Western countries. And it's really interesting because they have these encounters with the state bureaucracy or the police in Sweden or in Germany or in Australia, and those ambiguous fears about how the law operates in those new countries travel with them. And so it's not something that just goes away. It's like very much an embodied experience. So I would say, it's not always these grand things of like, the people that I know from Syria are all traumatized because they experience these terrible bombings and violence. It's a much more granular level about how people experience everyday life and the law and governance in their new countries where they now find themselves. And I don't think that always equates to, trauma necessarily, or, like a terrible response to that, or, they all need psychological help. Not at all. I mean, some of them are the most resilient and kind of dignified people that I know.
So as a researcher, you're always asking questions, just like we are in this conversation today. And you mentioned some of the research you're doing now. What are some of those questions that you'd like to dig into that you haven't had a chance to really get solid findings on yet?
So this work that I'm doing at the moment really is super interesting to me. So how people understand the law at that really everyday level after war or revolution, that's what I'm looking at specifically. My sort of the outgrowth to this current research is really to look at that in the Australian context, which I think will have ramifications for different Western countries as well, that receive either refugees or migrants that have some experience of war, because that's America, that's Australia, that's a lot of Western countries. And to better understand really at that everyday level how they are thinking about the law in these democracies, and also to how democracies, which we as people that live in Western democracies, how we think about the law for ourselves. We always think, oh, look, we live in great countries, thank God we don't live in, authoritarian states like Syria. But actually, so far, my research has said, look, there's much more in common, maybe uncomfortably, than we would like to think, about how the law and violence function actually in every state. And maybe that level of arbitrariness about how it functions in Australia might be really different to Syria, but at base, for some people, definitely still like our First Nations people, or if you're Black or brown in this country, the law can still function in this country in a very, very arbitrary way. So to try and make those connections across different ways of governance, different states, and for different people as well, on that really everyday level, that's kind of my next project.
Through all the work that you've done, you mentioned just how amazing people can be under stress and wartime experiences. Is there anything in your research, the people that you've met or the work you've done that was really surprising to you that gave you a new appreciation or insight into human nature or into how we operate in conflict and under stress?
I have a beautiful friend called Hossam who I met probably around 2016 in Jordan after he'd been displaced from Daraya. So he was one of the local leaders in Daraya who was influenced by a sheikh in that area who preached nonviolence and who preached things like gender equality and civil action completely in contravention of the regime. This was even before the civil war and the revolution started. And Hussam and his friends set up in Daraya an amazing local governance system that was based on the principles that the sheikh taught them. In the beginning, for example, when the Syrian regime invaded Daraya, they passed out bottles of water and flowers to the soldiers in sort of a gesture of non-violence. And then after the regime sort of surrounded and besieged their city, they really set up quite a complicated and complex and thoughtful systems of local governance that were really aimed at helping the fellow citizens of that town. For example, they set up a community kitchen where they combined all the food from the neighborhood. People that managed to find a way to leave, they took that food and they put it into a communal kitchen that they set up in order to feed the rest of the people that remained in the best way that they possibly could. They set up a library where they took all the books from the neighborhood and made a library where people could come to read and to learn and to sort of escape for a short time at least some of the violence that was going on. So, I mean, these are amazingly inspiring things that people do under immense pressure to create kind of a world that they would like to live in that was different from the one that had been created for them by the Assad regime.
And are there any misconceptions or things that, as you talk about this and you do your research and you've obviously done other media interviews, are there any things that you're concerned that maybe the audience might get wrong about conflict zones, about ceasefires, about people living in these areas? Any misconceptions that you want to try to correct?
I think the biggest thing that's, I guess, played on my mind a little bit lately, particularly with the current conflict in Gaza, is these sort of basically, look, a ceasefire is still the least worst option that we have, that humans have devised to kind of bring a conflict to some sort of halt. So I'm not saying that we don't need a ceasefire in Gaza. Like, from my opinion, we certainly do need a ceasefire. But what my research shows is that we should also be aware. We should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We should be aware that yes, we want a ceasefire, but what kind of things is that ceasefire going to put? What kind of terms does that ceasefire have? And what is the reality that ceasefire is going to put in place? Because be careful what you wish for. I think, maybe that ceasefire in some ways will be worse for people on the ground, than we think. So I guess that's really been the message of my research, is a little bit, look, it's the least worst option, but it's, be careful what you wish for, and to have a little bit of a broaden our understanding about the types of things ceasefires can affect.
If people would like to learn more about you, your research, or your work, what is the best way for them to follow up and to follow your work?
They can definitely Google my name. I have a very Googleable name. I've written quite a lot on ceasefires and on a range of different things, and they can go to my page at the University of Melbourne Law School, and they can send me an email from there if they like.
We'll put a link to that in the description of this program. Thank you so much for taking time to walk through a very complicated but very important topic. And I hope everybody got a good sense of people and your research and all the complexities that play into this very, very unique environment that you're spending so much of your time devoted to.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for your public service in, sharing all these stories with everybody too.
I think most of us can appreciate the incredible and unique skills required in international diplomacy for anyone who's engaged on an international level. But when you step back and think about a specific issue like a ceasefire and how much goes into that a world where there is no legally accepted or enforced definition for the term, in a world where there's no specific sanction for a party breaking a ceasefire, in a world where ceasefires can be used cynically by one side or another to advance their cause while trying to demonstrate or show some level of peace and restraint. In some ways, this concept exposes the most human of human elements of who we are, that every interaction between groups of people is built on trust. And that means a ceasefire has to be built on trust among warring parties who have no reason to trust each other, particularly those who have been actively killing each other in a battlefield setting and oftentimes for months or years at a time. Because there has to be trust to ensure that the deal that was reached will be enforced, even though there's no international mechanism legally to enforce what is effectively just a word of mouth commitment. That's how complicated the world can be. That's how complicated international diplomacy can be. And so I know there are many who listen to this show who have heard this concept for a long time now, over the last many months and a couple of years, specifically with conflicts in the Middle East, whether it was the Syrian conflict, which is still in many ways ongoing, or the horrendous violence between the Israelis and Palestinians in Gaza, in Lebanon, and other places. And then, of course, the conflict in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine. And there are many other zones in the world where there are active conflicts that are in need of some form of ceasefire, even if it doesn't result in a long-term permanent peace. But while it's easy to say, and many in the activist community have chanted and preached for this, the actual implementation is extremely complicated, and hopefully you have a better appreciation for why it is difficult to reach that point. And trust is the underlying element, and it is so extremely difficult to develop. And especially when you have decades and generations of mistrust between peoples, governments, and societies, and when you have outside actors and forces who say they want to be mediators and peacekeepers, but have their own interests involved. And there are so many people that need to be trusted in that process. I also thought one of the quotes that stood out to me was that a ceasefire means 20 things to 20 people. Just ask anyone and they'll give you a different idea of what it is. The thing that I do want to call out as we wrap up this episode, though, that might have skimmed past us in that conversation, and I thought about after we wrapped it up, was the idea that a ceasefire doesn't resolve a conflict, it just freezes it, which means that it continues on a low level, which means that preparations for future conflicts continue. It doesn't necessarily mean the killing stops. It usually means it just slows. It moves into a lower level and a lower state. And in the modern world, it might mean that the conflict moves from humans on a battlefield to a technological conflict in cyberspace. Or it means that the conflict evolves in a different way. Either way, it doesn't end or resolve. It simply moves it to a different status. And in some cases, a ceasefire trades the short-term pain of conflict for a longer-term pain that's even worse because both sides rearm and recommit to destroying the other. when we talk about conflict, we're talking about people. We can never forget that. And that's, I think, the lesson of this conversation with Marika today is this is really a study of people. Marika is many things, but anthropologist is one of them. And that's why I thought it was so great to bring her on to talk about this topic, because we're talking about people. And I brought that up, obviously, in the conversation. People are complicated, which means conflicts are complicated, which means resolutions to them are even more complicated. But if we remember that every conflict that we observe in the news is simply people in conflict with one another, in fundamental disagreements with one another, but that the same human elements that got us to that point can get us out of it, it might give us a different appreciation for what it takes to reach some sort of lasting peace. I would say if there's one thing that I took from this that I didn't have an appreciation for going in, it's the incredible, rare skill of a negotiator, that this person has to be one part statesman, one part psychologist, one part therapist, one part negotiator, and perhaps one part magician to actually get sides to come to terms on agreements. And above all, they have to be trust builders, and therefore they must be trustworthy and above reproach. And perhaps because there are so few of those people in the world, that is why it is so hard to ever reach ceasefires and compromises and conflicts, because it's the rarest of human skills that is required to implement them. I thank you all for listening to this program. It has been a lot of fun for me to continue to interview these wonderful guests, and we do that because we have listeners like you from around the world who are interested in these topics, and I love to hear from you. If you haven't already subscribed to the program, please do so on your favorite podcast platform: Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Libsyn, any place that you get your podcasts, you can find our program. And of course, we're on YouTube. You can find me at Brian J. Matos Podcast on YouTube, where we also post clips of these conversations, including my perspectives. And I want to hear from you, so feel free to leave links, or comments, I should say, on those YouTube videos. You can also reach out to me on any of my social media platforms. I'm on X at Brian J. Matos. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram. And of course, you can always email me directly, info at brianjmatos.com. You can also visit my website, brianjmatos.com, for all of our archived episodes, show notes, and more. Thank you so much for listening to this program. I look forward to talking to you again soon. And until next time, I invite you all and encourage you all to stay curious.